to give students a modern avenue in the world of selling their work, representing themselves at galleries, and using their looms as a canvas, as a narration device to tell their own stories. So a little bit of background here. So the photograph you see is my mother. That's Shema Arvita Aragon. And we're standing in front of our garden, and you see next to us, which I wish those were my hogans, but they're not. These are just a picture of two different hogans, the male and female one. And we ask, like, what is actually the hogan? What does it mean? Well, in Western terms, it's a university, it's a holy place, and it's a domicile, it's a home. So it is the foundation of our Navajo education. It's where all of that intergenerational transfer of knowledge once occurred. And the art form of weaving was part of that transfer of knowledge. Within these spaces, around these spaces, you would have your own families teaching you, like my mother was able to teach me. But many of us contemporary Diné people, we don't live solely in that world anymore. And so because of the historical formations that influenced our civilization and our culture and the world we live in today, many of us have lost the opportunity to learn these art forms from our masane or our nale, asan, and so on. And so when we think of the Hogan, we have to think of it as a multi-purpose building, a home, a university, and a holy place, the foundation of Diné education. And so we can go back in time to history to understand why we live the way we do today. So we're not going to go into the archaeological history of weaving, which is quite important and interesting in my opinion. But our story here today is going to start in the 1860s, when it is the time of American expansionism and settler colonialism. And the 1860s is when we have all of those stories, and many of you and your families probably have them, the stories of the Long Walk, the stories of Huerte. And so the United States government in entering this region, our people were independent and free, and to, curtail our power and to make us more controllable, they enacted the campaign of Scorched Earth, which was led by Kit Carson. And of course, that was an economic way of starving our ancestors by destroying our fields, our animals, our orchards, and people were left destitute. Our food sovereignty was diminished, and so many people turned themselves in at those places that we know today called Fort Wingate, places around Window Rock. And so we were forcibly removed and marched clear across the state of New Mexico, all the way to the eastern side, to a place that we call Huelte, the place of sorrow or the place of suffering. In English, this would be Fort Sumner or the Bosque Redondo Reserve. And so it was an internment camp. The people there had bad soil, bad water. They were under constant raids from Comanche and Ute horsemen. And so this time of suffering is burned into our collective memory as Diné people. But all through this time, the women that went there were continuing the process of weaving. They remembered weaving. And so they were issued military blankets from the government as part of their rations. And those blankets were very cheaply made. So our Masanesian, they uncoiled those blankets and they rewove them into things that were more warm, that were better suited for their survival. So the Net people would not have made it through all of the atrocities of history if it wasn't for our weaving and our Masanes who remembered the weaving practices. So in 1868, the treaty was signed between the Navajo leaders and the government, and we were allowed to return home, which is quite different than a lot of indigenous people in the country, where they were removed from their homeland, where they had to go to Oklahoma or some other foreign land, but we got to come home. And so Dinetra, our nation today, is our Aboriginal homeland. And so part of that treaty was to open up the reservation, the newly formed reservation, to Western education and Western commerce systems. And the boarding school era followed thereafter. And so this is a photograph of the Carlisle Industrial Indian School. from about 1890. And you could see all of these native children, taken from their homes, forced to learn a new language, a new religion, a new way of life. This was the beginning of that erosion of that intergenerational transfer of knowledge that had carried our people since the beginning, since we came from the origin, the Diné. And so a lot of our art forms as well began to suffer during this time because the children weren't at home anymore to teach. And of course, the trading posts rose from this time period as well. And so I think somebody's microphone is on. I hear some interesting feedback. The trading posts came as a part of the treaty. Licensed and unlicensed traders began to set up, and in the textile world, those trading postmen had a lot of power in economic power, and of course that translated into power over the weavers, the people who were producing items. And so the regional typology of weaving names. We have weavings that are called Ganado Red. We have weavings that are called Two Gray Hills, Tees, Wide Runes, Crystal, Chinley, and so on. Those are in reference to the trading posts that set up in those communities and began to influence the regional designs of those weavers in those communities. And so Ganado Red is well known because it has beautiful crimson red color, and that was a preference of the trading postman Lorenzo Hubble. He would oftentimes, if you read history, refuse to buy weavings that didn't have that beautiful crimson red. And to this day, the influence of those trading postmen is still present in a lot of those regions where people practice regional designs. So this is where my story connects with the history of weaving. My family, we were never bound to a trading post. I'm sort of like the younger generation of weavers, where we shed the idea of being tied to a trading post. But I do recall early on, in about high school, I'd say, I was learning to weave from my mother, and it was just the thing that people did. So I went to a trading post in my region, and I took one of my weavings in there, and it had this beautiful purple color and a little bit of wild other colors. And I always remember this because it continues to influence my life and my artistic practice. The trading postman looked at it and he says, well, these colors aren't traditional to Navajo weaving, and you didn't use symmetry, like one side of your weaving has a different design than the other. And so that doesn't look Navajo, and I can't sell it. So I'm not going to buy your work today. So I picked up my belongings and I walked out, and I never went back. But it always stuck with me. Who is this non-Navajo person, non-Diné person, telling me, a Diné person, the artist of this work, what Navajo weaving is supposed to look like? And so I had that experience with the sort of colonial trading post system and their economic power of deciding which work is authentic and which is not. And so I continued. I didn't listen to that feedback. I continued my experimentation and using my colors and reviving the natural dye techniques. And a lot of that comes from my mother here, this is her work on the photograph. This is more of my mom's work here. And you'll notice that our family is known for what we would call eye dazzlers, a lot of those serrated edges. And so that's partly because we're from the New Mexico side of the reservation. And so we had a lot more influence from the Spanish and the Mexicans. When they came up, they brought their textiles with them because those Spaniards and Mexicans didn't arrive to our homeland naked. They were clothed in textiles from Mexico. So saltillo blankets and sorapes. And so a lot of those chevrons and interesting designs were part of their textiles that our people incorporated, and they became known as eye dazzlers. And so when I started learning from my mother, she had very little recollection of the dye processes, the chemistry of natural dyeing, which, by the way, we have a course here at Diné College. It's called wool processing too. And she remembered the very basic recipes that her mom used. Like we would start out by going into the landscape, and she would say, "Oh yeah, your masana used to pick this plant and then boil it, and then we'd get colors out of it." But the knowledge, the ecological knowledge, the chemistry knowledge, the knowledge of mordants and additives and modifiers, that was very nearly lost in my family, because when the railroads arrived in the 1870s, the Santa Fe Railroad and so on, they also began to bring in synthetic dyes and machine spun yarns. So this whole other world and process of weaving, the loom work, the wool work, the carding of wool, the spinning it, the natural dyeing, that began to erode away because it was much cheaper to just use those little packets of synthetic dye to get colors from. And so when my mom started teaching me this and remembering the fragments of the dye heritage that she had, it set me off on a journey of remembering, of revitalization, of renaissance, of that tradition within my own family. And so you can see from the photograph, I'm there digging up Diné, which is a dock root. And you can see with the top photograph has experimentations with cochineal, which is an insect dye that our ancestors once widely used and was very valuable. It was traded up from Mexico. And then returning this knowledge to our communities. The last photograph was from at the Diné Native Plants program, where I hosted many natural dye workshops with them. So eventually, I got bored with the natural dyes because they do provide beautiful and rich colors, but there's a limited range from them. And so I began to experiment with synthetic dyes and combining them with my natural dyes. And so soon I had so many colors that I needed a way to organize them. And so I began to look to the natural world once again. And during those beautiful summertime, when the monsoon rains come and then leave, there's rainbows left behind. And for us native people, people from the desert, where water is always a precious thing, where any clouds or lightning or meteorological phenomena is very sacred to us. Water is life. And so the rainbow sequence appealed to me, and I started to weave in these rainbow patterns. And that led to the creation of a new design, a new aesthetic, which is known now as the expanded rainbow, el arco iris ampliado. And so this photograph is from my mom and I's first collaborative exhibition in Telluride at the AHA School for the Arts. And the one with the cross-shaped weavings, which I'll talk about later, is from my first curated exhibit titled From the Fringes, the Net Textiles That Disrupt at Center for Southwest Studies in Fort Lewis College. And so, it shows us the trajectory of our people's weaving, that once the trading post economy collapsed and the power, economic and stylistic power that traders had over our weavers, the Diné creativity comes back, and we expand on the traditions and the techniques of our ancestors, moving them from the past to the present and forward. And so I'll just quickly show some examples of my work. So these is influenced by water. And so these pieces, for me, I always think of water when I weave. And so one of them is titled The Movement of Water, and the other one is Prism of Emotions when looking at water. And this is a tufted technique. Tufting is a very ancient technique in our Navajo weaving repertoire. And my mom never wove these when I was growing up, but she told me stories of my masana who wove them. And they were usually done for saddle blankets, for horsemen, and for bedrolls and the cushion that the weaver would sit on. And so I took my mom's stories, and back then I didn't have, access to nice fleeces and lots of sheep. I'm from the farming side of the reservation, so we didn't have lots of sheep. We mostly grew food in the fields. And so I remember when we'd get a goat or something and we would butcher it, I would be there with my scissors afterwards cutting off those locks so I could wash them and then recreate these tufted weavings that my mom told me about. So I started to dye them and color them, and so this piece is titled Acid Rain. Here's a full tufted saddle blanket, and that one's titled Polychromatic Saddle Blanket. And next to it is another rare technique of Navajo weaving that's called a wedge weave. And so wedge weaving nearly disappeared from our toolkit. It lasted only about 40 or 50 years from until about the 1890s. We see it disappear from collections and people weren't producing them really at all. And we wonder why. We look back in time, and textile scholars and historians tell us that it was probably the influence of the trading posts that our ancestors stopped weaving wedge weave. And if you'll notice, the edge of the textile has these scalloped edges, and they're wavy, and the textile doesn't lay perfectly flat. When trading posts were coming in, they didn't need Navajo blankets, they didn't need bil'e, they didn't need sislachie. And so those utilitarian items were transformed into rugs that would be on a floor. So when even us Diné people today, we talk about Navajo rugs, Navajo weaving, but we never wove rugs. That's a very Western concept, that these precious items, these sacred items, these items that hold memory and philosophy and labor, they weren't ever just casually tossed on the floor in somebody's home. That's a different concept that came to us from the trading posts. So as we were transitioning from utilitarian items to rugs, the wedge weave disappeared probably because it didn't make for a good rug. It wasn't flat and it had weird corners. But that is one of the developments of our ancestors. That's a pure Navajo technique. With my life's work as well, I've had many great opportunities, both within my education and working within organizations. So this photograph is when I was doing my artist fellowship at the School for Advanced Research in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And my fellowship project was to survey the textile collections at the Indian Arts Research Center, which is one of the largest collections of Southwest Indigenous textiles in the country. And I was examining the collections looking for any techniques that fall outside of plain tapestry weaving. So I was looking for the various types of twills or hybrids of twills and two-faced and strange and unusual things that have been understudied and overlooked. And so the second part of my project was to create conventions or drafts so that I could, return them to my people, because a lot of these knowledges I view as Navajo cultural patrimony or Navajo intellectual properties. And so I wanted to return those techniques that I was able to reverse engineer from the collections to my own people. But that led to a problem of research, a problem of what do I do with this knowledge? Do I simply publish everything online and make it accessible in the public domain? And as we know right now, there's a lot of non-native people interested in learning our techniques and learning our looms. And I think that we haven't had in our communities a moment in time where we can have a critical discussion on the appropriateness of how much cultural knowledge and cultural art forms should be made available to the rest of the world. Because as we know from our history with anthropology and ethnography, a lot of those knowledges can leave our communities and then they run the risk of being misappropriated or misused or appropriated by, other people or entities. And so we could very easily see, someone taking our knowledge of these techniques and then creating, ready-made weave your own Navajo rug kind of kit that you can buy on Amazon or eBay or Etsy. And my goal is not to have that happen. I think we need to teach and perpetuate the knowledge in our own communities first, and then come together to have those critical discussions of appropriateness of how much we're willing to share. So continuing on that thread, these are some of the pieces I wove while I was at School for Advanced Research. There's some two-sided weavings where the front and back are different. And the central piece is two-faced checkers, which in all of the thousands of weavings at SAR, there was only one identifiable textile that had that. And I spent about 2 or 3 weeks studying the piece to be able to reconstruct the technique. And of course, I didn't weave the designs that were on those techniques. These are all my own designs using those techniques. Here's another tufted piece and another two-face weaving. And the tufted weaving was interesting because I had been dyeing the locks and weaving with the colored locks for a while before I was at SAR. And I thought I was the very first one, and I thought I was being cool and innovative. But then I found two tufted pieces at SAR. One of them had, dyed Navajo churro locks that were with like lime green and red. And so it was very humbling to be reminded that our ancestors and our forebears that came before us had this great amount of innovation and creativity and uniqueness, but reminded as well that a lot of that was suppressed by the trading post economy. And so there's various forms of twills, and I'm very proud of this. And, as the Net people, we're always told to be humble about our creations and ourselves and how we talk about ourselves. But as a contemporary artist, I have to be juggling both worlds, and I have to, make these statements that put your work and situate your work within the history of our weavings. So I'm very proud to say that my expanded rainbow aesthetic, when I started weaving them into twills, is my biggest contribution to our repertoire of our Diné people. That I was the first one to create these rainbow twills, because typically twill weaving you'll see in only three colors, as you see in the central weaving. And you can expand on that creation, but my expanded rainbow into twills is a unique innovation of our Diné weaving. And so these are other types of twill weaving. These are things that I was able to find at SAR. So you have a reversing twill, you have a 2-unit small diamond twill, you have a diamond twill with a delayed heddle technique, and a very classic diamond twill on the end. And so one year I was working at the Herd Museum in Phoenix, Arizona. I was putting contributions together for an exhibit titled "Towards the Morning Sun: Navajo Weavings, Navajo Pictorial Weavings with Sacred and Ceremonial Themes," and those were from the Rebecca and Jean-Paul Villette collection that was donated to the Herd Museum. So one of these pieces came out, and it was a cross-shaped weaving, which I had never seen in person. I had heard stories about them, but very little is known in the literature about cross-shaped weavings. And so I was kind of taken with it, and it was nice to handle it and to study it. And it got me thinking of, what was the purpose of these structures? Why did our ancestors weave such unique things, going beyond the capabilities of the warp and weft to create a shaped piece? And so there was some reference written by non-Navajo people about them, referencing them as possible table covers and, curio items. And for me, through my Diné eyes, I saw the cross-shaped weaving as something more important. And we know, in reference to where we learned weaving, Spider Woman and Spider Man, their symbol is a cross, and it's very ancient. It appears on textiles, it appears on basketry, it appears on petroglyphs and pictographs, and it's one of those recognizable symbols of Navajo weaving, which there are not a lot that are universal, but Spider Woman's crosses are. And so for me, the pieces were referencing the spider people. And so it got me thinking about how to replicate and how to create my own today. So I was fortunate enough, after my research got out there, that other institutions started to re-examine their collections. And so over here, you'll see the Center for Southwest Studies also had one cross-shaped weaving out of the hundreds of weavings they had. And so we've looked at many collections across the country. We've reached out to lots of textile scholars. And what we can say is that there's probably less than 5 that we known about today. And so they are very rare, and little is known about them. So these are my contemporary renditions of the cross-shaped weavings. And for me, they always reference Spider-Woman. And so beyond the scope of this presentation, I can't really go into the meanings of the designs and the techniques here, but know that they are in reference to Spider-Woman and Spider-Man. Here's some more of the cross-shaped weavings. The one with the tufting around it is called Journey to the Home of Spider-Woman, which references the creation story about the hero twins when they first encountered the technology of weaving. And on that note, I think now is the time when I look out my window and I'm seeing the grasses and the plants starting to come up. And in our Diné calendar system, I think it's kind of too late to talk too much about the creation stories out of season. And I know it was just snowing last week, but I see green stuff growing, so I'm going to not talk about those creation stories too much. But here's some of my other work, and one thing that I want my younger Diné people to know, even my older Diné people to know, is that um, ever since the very beginning of weaving, the loom has been a place for your thoughts to manifest in physical form. You're bringing beauty into the world on your loom. And equally so, in the old days, when trains started to come into the region, weavers started weaving trains onto their textiles. And in some ways, they were documenting the arrival of Western technology. They were providing a visual reference for us descendants to learn from. And in the same way that people were weaving yebiche and they were weaving sand paintings, they were weaving ceremonial times, those people, whether or not they knew it, were weaving for us references for us later people to learn from. And so for me as a modern Diné person and all of the things that we're connected to in the world today, there's some references on this piece. It's from my series called Ceasefire. And you'll notice there's a Palestinian flag and an Israeli flag woven in the same textile. And the tufting on the front side, the locks are meant to look like fire because these are flags that are burning. So my question was, what is the symbolism of burning flags, right? And it depends on whose flag is burning and who's burning the flag. But I'm seeing all these things happening in the world today, and I wanted to put it into one of my textiles. And then you'll notice there's three languages on the backside. There reads Salam, Shalom, river, and sea. So that's Hebrew and Arabic for peace. And river and sea is in reference to the geographic area where there's this major conflict happening now in the world. And you'll notice the arrows you see that are on the textile are broken. And so for a lot of indigenous people, when war is over, conflict is done, arrows are broken, and that's a symbol of peace. And in this case, it could also mean the loss of protection because those arrows are also protective symbols for our Diné people. This is another series from the Flags on Fire. This one is it's a titled Burning Pride Flag. And, observing the world today, I see all of this political and social turmoil and the attacks on the smallest population in our country, which is the queer population. So we see all these attacks on our queer relatives. And so this piece, I wrote the words fascism, or I wove the words rather, fascism loves hate, in reference to the social and political environment that we see ourselves on now. And we're seeing for a while, and we still are, a lot of attacks on LGBTQ centers. You see queer people being targeted. You see a lot of pride flags being vandalized because of this rise of hatred in the country and in the world today. And so my hope is that these pieces, which are in a permanent collection, will be preserved. And maybe 100 years from now, our Diné people will look back on this time and they'll see these references and they'll get a sense of what we were living through in this time, just as weavers of the past wove trains, the arrival of Western technology. This is capturing our modern moment now. And so here's a last piece, Fight Fascism, Defend Equality, and it's on a flag as well. It's on a trans flag. And so what I teach in my courses is that our looms are more than just, a place to create designs. They're a place for your thoughts and your life to be put into semi-permanent form. They're a place for you to have a voice. And so I think inherently our looms are political. Just as an artist or a painter has a canvas, our looms act in the same way. And they don't only preserve our tradition and our culture and our language and our philosophy, but they also capture who we are now, and that is always changing. And so here's some more of my work. I'll just go through the end because I'm getting a little bit close on time here. So curvier linear lines is another experiment in Navajo weaving. And the central piece with all of the three-dimensional blocks, we've always had connections. I think Navajo weavers had connections with other big movements that were happening in the art world. And so from the 1950s and 60s, with the rise of op art, with people like Victor Visarelli and other artists in that genre, we have Navajo weavers incorporating those elements into our textiles as well. And so that's a bit of my background work, but that leads me to the last part of my presentation, which is my work here at Diné College in the Navajo textile, the Navajo Cultural Arts program, teaching Navajo weaving to our people. And so a big part of that question I had from my research at School for Advanced Research was, how do I get this knowledge to my people without making it, in the public realm where anybody could access it and potentially misuse it or profit off of it? The cultural patrimony of my ancestors is not lightly taken. And so the solution to that problem came in the form of a phone call from the cultural arts manager asking if I would like to teach at Diné College. And so I had never taught before. And so it was kind of a new direction in my life, because at that time I was working for the National Park Service as an interpretive park ranger. And so I thought, yeah, what the heck, let's do it. Let's try it out. And I fell in love with the institution and being able to bring all of my accumulated knowledge and skills and research back to my people, which is very profound for me. And so here's more photographs of some of the work I was doing at SAR. And you'll notice some of the techniques that show up in the photographs are then utilized later by my students. And so for me, this is a lifelong process of revival, of renaissance, of, repairing tattered fragments of memory of our history and our culture that was nearly lost. Because as I know now, when I do my surveys to my students, I ask them, how many of you come from weaving families? And like most everybody raises their hand, because we are all from weaving families. But then I ask them, how many of you have a mother or a grandmother or a direct relative who is an active weaver today? And then all of those hands drop. And so about 95% of my students already come from homes where weaving has skipped one or two generations, and they're now picking it back up. And so we have a very pressing matter at hand, and that's the preservation and renaissance of our cultural traditions before they are fully lost. One year in teaching at Diné College, I was able to take my students to the Center for Southwest Studies in Durango, Colorado, and we were able to access the museum collections. And I wanted my students to learn how museums handle and care for the material culture of our people. Because most of us, we don't have large collections of weavings that our Masan has made or that were gifted to us. We might have a few textiles because our ancestors were making those weavings to feed the family. And so they left the home oftentimes. And so those weavings were sold so that people could eat. And so we don't have a lot of those material resources in our homes. So the next best place to study them and learn from them is in the institutions where they are cared for. And so we can visit those institutions and we can extract a lot of data from textiles and their techniques, their materials, and their aesthetics that is important for us today as people who are taking back up this art form. Other things that we teach, we have wool processing one class where we explore fully what it means to process a fleece. So we take the wool, we don't shear a sheep, but we might in the future. But we have sheared wool, shorn wool that's raw, and we learn how to wash it, to skirt it, to not tangle it, to not felt it. And then we learn various processes of wool and fiber preparation. So in the photograph you see, we're doing hand carding, but we also do wool combing. We also do a bit of felting. And then we have another class that centers entirely on the dyeing process, the chemistry of natural dyes, wool processing 2. And this is a great class if anyone is interested in learning ecology, chemistry, geology, animal husbandry. We learn about all of these multidisciplinary aspects that come together in this art form of natural dyeing. And so it's a bit strange, I suppose, for many of us today to come together at a college institution and to learn these art forms, because as it was in the past, we used to learn all of this from our family members. It was a very private affair. But as I've stated, many of our people don't have that opportunity anymore. Their elders are gone, their elders never passed it on to them. And so we are not left destitute. We are not left without a way forward. We have here at Diné College the only Navajo weaving program where you can earn a certificate. You can even earn a BFA. This is the only place you can get a Bachelor's of Fine Arts with a concentration in Navajo weaving is right here at Diné College. So we have to form a new community. We have to form a new environment. And this is the confluence of our indigenous pedagogy within this Western academic tradition. And that's what, for me, is so cool about Diné College and so unique about our TCU. And so more photos of the studios. There's people doing natural dyeing, people working together on various projects, different stages of weaving. Oh, and by the way, we also have several weaving classes. We have an intro class where you can learn all the basic steps and weave a project. We have foundations where you can build upon geometric motifs and designs. It's the basis for tapestry weaving and pictorial weaving. And then we have an advanced techniques class where you can learn those various twills and two-face weaving techniques of our ancestors that are very rare today and less practiced. And so, yeah, a lot of my education is centered on bridging the knowledge of our ancestors, archaeological knowledge, historical knowledge, ethnographic knowledge, with contemporary elements, STEAM, science, technology, engineering, arts, and mathematics into this curriculum that we have within our BFA program. And yeah, we also utilize a lot of local resources and a lot of non-local resources. So the shiprock with the leaves, those are cottonwood leaves that were just right outside our classroom at the shiprock campus. And we just went and picked some and used it for our dye practice. The other photograph is cochineal that is going to be modified. So we don't really have the type of farmed cochineal that they have in Mexico. That's where it comes from, Mexico and South America. We do have wild versions of cochineal, but they don't grow in excess where we could harvest them. So we do have to expand out of our locality and use dyes that are from other regions, but that's part of our process of reclamation. And of course, the very art form of hand spinning, of processing raw fibers into usable material, into yarns that can be woven, that in itself is nearly a lost art form. There's lots of weavers out there today. And if you go to trading posts, if you go to art galleries or art curio shops like in Gallup, and you survey those textiles, you could probably say safely that 90, 95, maybe 98% of those weavings are made from commercially spun yarns. And very few of them today are actually made from hand spinning. And so that's something that we also teach that process in our courses as well. So I think the long work of teaching these art forms is to create a core group of people. In every generation, there has to be somebody who carries the knowledge forward. And every student that comes into my classroom and learns these techniques, they go back out into the world, they return to their communities or their families, and many of them are the last generation of people in their families who are capable of bringing back these knowledges to return to their families and reviving their weaving family's tradition. And so that's what I'm most proud of about our very special and unique program here at Diné College. And I'll close with this. This is my last slide. This is my niece, and she doesn't live with us. She actually goes to school international. She goes to school in Switzerland. And every summer that she comes back, she's able to weave with my mom and myself. And so I think this is a characteristic of the dynamic nature of many of our families today is that we're not all in one house. We're not all connected all the time. But from the modern technologies that we have, digital technologies, we have writing systems, we have databases, we have libraries, we are very much able and capable of preserving these knowledges, not only for us now, but for the Diné people that are yet to come. And so that's our greatest hope in terms of saving this cultural art form, is that it is such an integral part of our identities as Diné people. The philosophies, the language, our material history, all of that is found within the Navajo weaving loom and the practice of weaving. And we are able and capable of saving these things for future people. And so I don't like to leave on on a sad or sullen note that, our art form is disappearing, our language is disappearing. Well, those are reactionary responses to a problem. And what we're doing here at Diné College with our textile arts program is we're providing a solution. We're providing a way forward for our people to remember and to learn and to keep this tradition alive. Because I think it is said by many Hitakli that when we no longer speak Dinepazad, that's the signal, that's the prophecy that the end of the world is coming and the beginning of a new one is upon us. And so I believe very much that our weaving tradition is also part of that perspective, that if we ever lose it, we lose what it means to be Diné people and what separates us from other tribes and other nationalities. We lose something very important if we ever lose our weaving tradition. And so, yeah, everyone, thank you for listening to me and tuning in today. And I think we have some questions in the chat. So let's see, Rochelle or